right, this is Jim over at the Book Loft. I'm here in conversation with Tiffany McDaniel. It's pretty exciting. I guess first of all, I just wanted to mention a few things, starting with I wanted to thank Gary Lovely, who helped set up this Zoom meeting. I also wanted to thank Glenn Welch, two people I work with. He actually coordinated this whole thing. Couldn't have done this without Glenn. I also wanted to mention that this is going to be recorded on our YouTube channel. So the best way to access that is going to be going to bookloft.com. You're also going to be able to buy the book. It's right here behind me. Let me point at it. That's Betty right there. This is Tiffany's new book. That's the one we're going to be talking about today. And to begin with, Tiffany, I sent you an email earlier that mentions a passage that is actually like my personal favorite passage from the book. And I was hoping that you could just read that for us. I just think it's particularly powerful. It's one I really enjoyed myself.
And can you remind me on the page number on that? I'm sorry.
That's 305. It starts, I can't remember the exact beginning that I mentioned, but it's
once I found it. Okay. Once I got back to the house, I stepped over the vines in the garden and picked a tomato. I ate it whole, the juice dribbling down my arm. When I turned, I saw Dad sitting in the swing on the back porch. I carefully tiptoed around the lettuce heads and broccoli florets, past the cucumbers trailing up the trellises as I wiped tomato juice off my chin. "Hey, Dad," I said, coming up the porch steps. On the floorboards by his feet was a pile of pants he had patched. Another pair about to be fixed was draped across his lap. I leaned against the rail and watched him search through buttons in a cigar box beside him. His right leg was stretched across his stool he'd brought out from the living room. I could tell his knee was acting up from the way his leg would twitch. "Why don't you ever make any plans for your own aches and pains?" I asked. "I guess I never thought I deserved to be free of them," he said, still studying the buttons. "Some pain you know you'll always hold on to. Maybe if I was younger, looking ahead at things, I might feel differently." I tried to think of my father as a boy under the stars, dreaming he would have a life no harder than the boards of his front porch. I knew my father in his youth must have been stirred by legends and myths, hoping to become a legend himself, only to then have to leave such fancies in the musky earth when it was time for him to grow up and become just another man as invisible as dew on any given morning. I stared into his wrinkles. They reminded me of ridges in sandstone, high on the sides, carved out in the middle like the soft stone. His face was becoming as ancient as the land. One day I thought, I will wake up and he will have moths growing on his eyelids. His cheekbones will have pushed through his flesh like rock pushing through the hillside. Erosion will turn him into something I barely recognize until I will have to lay him on the hills amongst the stone most like him. "Dad, what'd you want to be?" "What did I want to be? Don't you mean what do I want to be?" "When you were my age," I said on the swing beside him. "What do you think you do with all your life?" "Oh, when I was young, you mean?" "Well, when I was a boy, I always thought I'd stay that way. It's so much easier to be a boy than it is to be a man, and it's the only thing I've ever been good at, so I reckoned I was going to be 11 forever." And yet he was decades older than the boy he thought he'd spent eternity being. A large part of my father's life had become him trying to catch his breath. He'd had a hard time with hard jobs. It was no wonder his body was giving in. His cane was solid proof of that. Dad had made the cane himself with our faces stacked in the order of our births. Around Leland's head, Dad carved half the sun merging with the moon, the stars shaping a crown. Frey was surrounded by dandelions, the bright yellow blossoms nearly covering her face. Though Yara was dead and gone, he was not forgotten, nor was the buckeye nut that took his life. Dad spent time carving the delicate features of Wakanda's infant face. Flossie was given a little pale Oscar statuette, which made her squeal in delight when she saw it. A rainbow extended around Trustin's face, while Lint was carved with enough plants to remedy any complaint. In between Flossie and Trustin, I was carved with a raven feather. When I asked Dad why a raven's feather, he said that many years ago, when the trees and mountains were in their infancy, great beasts roamed the land while people sat around fires and told stories. The ravens, Dad said, hearing these beautiful stories, knew they needed to be written down to be preserved. So each raven decided to pluck a feather from their body. They offered these feathers to the storytellers. but a pen needs its ink. A raven's blood runs black as night sky, so the wise birds bit their own tongues, their black blood spilling to the pens of the poets and storytellers. By the sacrifice of the raven, stories found wing from one generation to the next. Some men carried photos of their children in their wallets. Dad had his cane. Maybe he thought carving us in wood would force time to stand still, our faces never to age beyond the youth he'd sculpted with his knife. This one will do, he said, deciding on the brown marbled button from out of the cigar box. I watched his shaking hands thread the needle. Decades of gardening had stained his hands. You could see all the seasons he had hauled black walnuts and all the times he had pulled weeds. Green and brown and black. The colors of the stain settled into the deep cracks and splits of his fingers. Green and brown and black and violet. The color of the berries he canned mixing together into hues that splashed his skin. Green and brown and black and violet and red. The stains had tinted his skin the color of the earth itself. I was certain that if I laid a seed inside his hands, that seed would root and grow from his palms as if buried in dirt. The same dirt crusted around his short nails. The beauty and the hardship of working with the land had formed calluses in the very spots he'd held onto, the hoe the longest. People would use all kinds of words to describe my father's hands. Tough, leathery, as split and grooved as tree bark. Folks would say his hands were, above all else, rough, but I knew his touch was soft. Everyone just took one look at my father's hands and thought they knew his worth in the world. I was always told I wasn't significant, he said as he began binding the button to the pant flap. You get told that enough and you start to believe it. He tied off the thread before snapping it with his teeth. Some men ain't worth mentioning. He held up the pens to look at his work. They're fillers. That's what I am. A filler. A step others climb on to get to the top. The paint drop in the portrait of a greater man. It used to bother me, but now I'm too old to give a damn. He laid his pants aside as he stood up from the swing and grabbed the broom, leaning against the wall. For the next few minutes, I watched an old man sweep dust off his porch. If there is anything more to be said, it is that the dust he swept off blew back into his beautiful old face.
I love that. I feel like that, and just hearing that gives me chills. I really feel like if you didn't know who Landon was, I guess for background's sake, that's Betty's dad in the story, and that's a very important relationship between Landon and Betty. If you didn't know who he was before that, reading that, you know afterwards. Like that's really one of those passages where I had to set the book down for a minute and take a deep breath. I really, really enjoyed that. And just talking about that relationship, I feel like that has a pretty big footprint on the book. But I also wanted to talk about Betty's mother, Alka, because I feel like even though Landon has that big footprint, Alka kind of casts a shadow over the whole book. And, you know, you have those recurrent images where she's always associated with thunderstorms. And, you know, like I feel like some of the best moments of dramatic irony are hers too. You know, there's that horrible scene where Landon's working at the mine and, you know, they paint a racial epithet across his face. And he asks, I don't know how much we want to, how far into spoilers we want to get here. But
no, I think that's fine. I think that's that's kind of on the surface. So I don't think he'll ruin it for anybody.
Right. So, you know, like he says, you know, have you ever been held down and had things done to you? And her jaw tightens. And as a reader, you know the context of that. And, you know, I thought that's a really powerful character. Do you want to talk a little bit about Alka?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Landon is based on my papa, Landon, and Alka is based on my mama, Alka. And going back to Landon, he had died over a decade before I was born, but Alka I grew up with. You know, she was someone who was in my life. And when I was a kid, you know, she was someone who could be sweet and loving and kind, but then she would immediately take a turn and be someone who was very distant. And when I was a kid, it was difficult to understand what that meant. When I was older and she had shared her history and her backstory and the things that she had experienced as a kid, then I understood that change in emotion that she carried. But I always saw her as someone who was looking out at the sky. You know, she was always talking about the weather, talking about the rain coming in, the storm coming in. And for me, it really carried such a greater weight. When she was talking about a storm, it felt more than this sort of celestial activity. It felt like it was something internally, and it felt like it was something that she was pulling from her past. And so I wanted to really represent her in that pairing with the storm, the dark clouds, the thunder, the lightning, because it felt like these were things that she was facing. But with the storm, when you think about it, they don't last forever, and the clouds will eventually clear and the sky will come and the sun will come. And so when I thought of her, you know, she may have had these experiences and it may have felt like living in this sort of storm for her, but at the end of it, those clouds cleared and she survived it. And I think that that's really what I wanted to show with her story, was that even if these terrible things happen, they can be survived. And I think she's such a strong character to me, such a strong woman to me. And I really wanted to honor that memory of her. You know, she died when she was in her 90s. And so during the 2 decades I was working toward getting this book published, you know, she would kind of check in on progress on publication. And she was sort of eager to see her story told, because she felt like through that it would inspire others who might be going through the same thing. So she's always such an inspiration for me.
That's very cool. You know, I feel like it is like a very nuanced character in the book too, because, you know, on the one hand, you have her kind of tormenting her daughters, if that's the right word, to try and like prepare them for, you know, what she feels life is hard. You know, they need to like be strong to face the things, like, and maybe like possibly avoid some of the things that she went through too. But then you have that great story about the imaginary donuts. And I mean, you know, I don't know, do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I really like, that was another passage I considered having you read, just because like, I really like just how that plays out, and then how it ends, you know, where you have Landon say, you know, good mother, and, you know, Betty, you know, kind of reacts to that. But yeah, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, and I think I go back to kind of Alka, and it is very much like she was preparing her daughters, and I reflect back on her own mother. And, you know, when Alka shared that story with me, and she shared that her mother was the one who had carried her to that abuse, and the mother was really part of it. And I think that what Alka did that really separated her from her mother and really made her into a better mother was that she found someone like Landon, who she knew was the complete opposite of her father. And so from the beginning, that she was creating this really safe home environment, which she didn't have. And with the girls, you know, they're coming of age with someone like Landon. And so their idea of abuse, they had no recognition of it. And so she really wanted to say to them, especially when she shared that story with Betty at the same age she would have been when she experienced that abuse, she's telling Betty that these things happen, and you have to be prepared for them. And it's not to say that they will happen, but if they do happen, these are the things, and they're wrong. And I think that that was such a contrast to Betty at the time, because she had lived with Landon, and so she knew that love. And then Alka was showing this whole other side. And I remember what Alka said, you know, she said she didn't speak of the abuse when she was a little girl, because she thought it's what happened in every family, because it was both her mother and her father, and they were the only adults in her life. And so there was no difference in her world. And so when she would look out at the other houses, she would think that, well, the same thing is happening to other little girls or other little boys in those houses. And for her, she really wanted people to speak about it, because she learned later in her life that if someone had spoken about this abuse, if it would have been something that maybe the community had resources for, that she could have seen that, oh, wait a minute, this isn't supposed to be happening to me. And so she's someone who I think she really wanted to prepare her daughters. And I really, with the donut scene, I really wanted to show the love that Alka still had, because she was a loving mother to her children. She had those moments and those breaks, and that history sort of caught up to her. But with the donut scene, you know, it's at a time when the family didn't have very much money, and Landon was off working, as he often was. He would be gone for weeks at a time, especially back then in the 30s and the 40s, when work was kind of more migratory, and he would leave the family and then he would come back with the paycheck. And at this time, you know, he had left Alka, and it was winter. They didn't have the garden. Their cupboards were bare. She had all these children, and, you know, she she saw that they were hungry and that they were crying. And so she made them imaginary donuts. You know, she took this bowl and she pretended to mix the flour and the sugar. And for them, it was enough to satisfy her children's hunger, enough to see that their mother was there, they loved her, and that she was able to provide them with some sort of food, even if it wasn't tangible food in front of them. So that will always be a scene that I think really shows the complete mother she could have been. But just because you become a mother doesn't mean that you shed that history or that past. And so she carried it with her, but that moment will always be the moment that she really showed the mother that she was.
Yeah, and I think throughout the book there are scenes like that. I mean, one of the, like, because it is a big story in a way. I mean, it is a multi-generational story, but I think something that you do very well is like there are those like almost insulary vignettes that I think really like make this story more personal for the reader. I mean, I think it might be easy to get lost in a story that spans from Betty's like early childhood all the way to adolescence, and then you also include in the beginning the actual like meeting of Alka and Landon. So yeah, like I said, a big story, but like in those moments, you almost feel like you're in the kitchen with them, like kind of like a fly on the wall. And I really enjoyed that. It's also interesting to me, like there are a lot of themes of like motherhood and sisterhood. A lot of great women characters in this. Just something I kind of wanted to ask you about. I've actually like read some interviews that you've done in the past, and I watched. I think it was for a book club or another bookstore. You're talking about Betty. I watched an interview where you talked about The Summer That Melted Everything, which is a book is your first book, kind of. It's a book that I really enjoyed. I love the gruesome twist at the end. I thought I recommended it to a lot of people. But technically speaking, you wrote Betty first, and yet The Summer That Melted Everything came out second. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I thought
Yeah.
that was fascinating. I mean, I think, and also timely considering.
Yeah, absolutely. So Betty is the first book I wrote nearly 20 years ago. And then The Summer That Melted Everything was actually about the fifth or sixth book I wrote. And then it was the first published. And so I think people think that just because I have the recent releases that I'm new to publishing, but I've been here for a while and it's taken me a long time. I think people think I'm younger than I am, but I'm going to be 40 in a few years. So I've been here for a while, pushing along. And when I first went out with Betty, because I wanted to be the first published novel, and I was querying agents. And at that time, you did it through mail. There wasn't email wasn't sort of the common way that you reached out to them. So you'd have to wait several months to hear back. And they would say they love the writing, but there were some issues. And I noticed that the feedback was, this is too female. Can you take out the mention of the bra, the menstruation, sort of those things that might make readers uncomfortable? They suggested I give the women romantic relationships. I remember one agent said that, I had made sex into a bad guy, and I needed to have cheerier moments for the women. And so at that time, hearing it now,
I'm sorry, did you say tearier moments?
it feels very offensive. Yeah, cheerier, because he said the women were very cheerier. Yeah, because he said the women were very bitter and standoffish and angry, and we should see the women being happier or cheerier. And I think he overlooked sort of the things that they had gone through and sort of building on that subject matter. And I think the Me Too movement helped that, because it gave a platform to maybe these types of stories that people maybe weren't as comfortable with before, but now we sort of lean into these stories a bit more. And so there was a lot of opposition to this book, a lot of pushback, and I actually didn't think it would ever get published. And 11 years into the journey, I had heard from some agents, you should make Betty a boy because boys sell better, and it could be the Huckleberry Finn of your generation. I didn't write Huckleberry Finn, but I was
That's a
adamant
strange
that,
comment to
yeah,
begin with,
it
but
is.
yeah.
And I was adamant that Betty really stay a girl, because everything, that happened in her life, it was really identifying. And so I heard that so much. I wrote This Summer That Melted Everything. And, I wrote it to have a male character. It fit that story, so I didn't feel like it was a change that wouldn't be appropriate for it. But the prior novels also had female protagonists, so The Summer That Melted Everything felt like the next best step. And so that would have been 11 years in, and that went on submission. It sold in a month, so I think it sort of did show the industry's appetite for male leads versus female leads. But yeah, it ended up being the first published, and then Betty sort of got put back on the back burner again. But it was always a book that they just always said it wouldn't be published. It didn't have the audience, and it takes place in Appalachia. And early in the 2000s, this is before Hillbilly Elegy and those sorts of stories really put this region on the map. And I remember one agent saying, readers really want to read either a book based in California or New York. Middle America is very hard to sell. And so, I really think that readers love all kinds of regions. I think that they really love to explore places that they don't necessarily live. And so there just seemed to be a lot of pushback for the novel, and I didn't think it would get published. And then you keep working on it, and you sort of stay determined, and you keep doing outreach, and eventually it lands. But it was a long haul.
Yeah, it's a little amazing to me. I mean, obviously, like I don't have the same experience that you do, but if I had to say, like, I think Betty, the reason it's kind of amazing is that if I had to say which was the more powerful novel, like which novel like affected me more, I really, really enjoyed The Summer That Melted Everything. And I actually read it because Donald Ray Pollock recommended it. He wrote you that great blurb. And that was kind of, I feel like, the beginning of sort of Appalachian Gothic, being tied into the whole Southern Gothic tradition. Although that's kind of interesting too, just on the basis that, I think about novels like Winter's Bone or like, True Grit even by Charles Portis, but mainly by men. So it's kind of nice to see this like an Appalachian story, not only about women, but by a woman. Like, I feel like there's a certain truth there that, like, I believe that really comes through. And so I guess what was confusing to me about it was that this isn't a sophomore novel, but it feels like stronger than The Summer That Melted Everything. Like, I really think, I can't believe you had difficulty. I guess I can, and yet I don't want to believe that you had difficulty getting this published, because I thought it was really fantastic and kind of unique in a genre that probably needs this expansion. Like, I think you're doing something right for sure. The other thing that you talk about in the book, and I think you do very well, is the issue of race is also central to the story. Landon is a Cherokee. He faces racism in his life and his work, and as does Betty. And I thought that one of the things that you do very skillfully in the novel is, I think, like, as white people, we often think of brown skin as an obstacle, and so we tend to cast it in a negative light. And while prejudice is an obstacle, and ironically, like, white people are an obstacle to the success of brown people in many, many instances, especially at that time and now, you also make it a source of strength for Betty. And do you want to talk a little bit about that? I mean, because you have, like, not only like Landon as a teacher, as like a good father, but also as like a conduit for that heritage.
Yeah, so I should say I am fair skinned, and my mom has brown skin, and Landon have brown skin. And I remember when I was growing up, my peers would say, "I didn't know you were adopted, Tiffany," because they would see my mom, and they would say, she's not your mom. And I say, yeah, it's my mom. So there was always a difference of them sort of saying, you know, she's very dark. Does she just tan all day? Does she have a tanning bed? And so I caught those glimpses of very sort of passive racism. But when I did the sessions with mom for the book, she filled me in on that very intense racism that she faced growing up, you know, the racial slurs, and hearing how, you know, Papa was beaten up by white men in these communities, and that they had these difficulties living in communities that at the time were predominantly white. And so they were really coming in those communities as someone who was different. And when we look at the racism in the book, you know, I wanted to show that, but I also want to show the internal dialogue between Landon and Betty, to show that Landon was telling Betty, you know, this isn't something that we should be ashamed of. It's not something that we should hide from. You know, our Cherokee heritage is important, it's to be valued, and we should really represent ourselves the best as we can be. And he was always, you know, he says in the book, do you know why I call you Little Indian? And he tells her, so that you know that you're somebody special. And he relays to her the message that when he was a child, you know, they didn't even call him by his name. And so those in the community who had racist views of him and his family. And so he was really trying to change that path forward, and he was really trying to make that heritage something positive. And we see Betty struggling to fit into these communities. And, you know, as I listened to mom talk about what she experienced, you know, it wasn't just her peers or her classmates. She was also experiencing that racism from the adults in her life, you know, the teachers. I remember she had talked about, it was career day at school. It's not in the book, but she had said everyone was going to the gymnasium, and the teacher just told her to stay behind because, you know, she wasn't going to do anything with her life. And so even from the adults in that time and place, and especially in somewhere that it should have been more nurturing environment like the school, she was up against those views of people who were not white skinned like the rest there. And so she really struggled to fit in, but Landon was that support system, and he was her ally. And he really said, no, you are beautiful, and you are strong, and you're powerful. And having that sort of father for a daughter who was coming of age was just such a powerful ally in her life. And so that's something that I really wanted to preserve from Landon and mom's relationship, was that he was this source of strength for her, and this source of strength to say, there's nothing wrong with the way you look. You should be proud of it, and know that you are so strong as you are.
Yeah. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. And then, you know, you also have Flossie, and I thought that was interesting too, like the differences between Flossie and Betty. I mean, I think that was kind of illustrative too. Just for context sake, Flossie's always like performing, and I think it's very interesting because Flossie in the book is fair-skinned, and, you know, doesn't face the same kind of ostracization that Betty does. And I mean, I'm sure that was purposeful, but do you want to talk about that relationship a little bit?
Yeah, so Flossie, yeah, I have fond memories of Flossie. She's based on an aunt, and she was, you know, always buzzing about the house. And I would come home from school, and she would have the music on. She'd be putting her makeup on, and I remember her saying, you know, I was supposed to be more famous than Elizabeth Taylor. She always wanted to be an actress, and you know, she had a bit of a sad story. You know, she eventually became an addict, and that's sort of how she spent the remaining decades of her life, as she does in the book. And so she never quite made it to that stage that she wanted, but I wanted to preserve that bond of sisterhood. You know, after she passed away of the overdose, you know, mom still has those voice messages of the day that she died, and she still listens to them today, even though it's been several years since she passed. And so I really wanted to preserve that sisterhood. And it goes back to, I remember when that agent said we should see the women having romantic relationships for support, but I really wanted to see these women leaning on each other. You know, they get the support from themselves, as Freya says in the book. You know, we can save ourselves. We don't need anybody else. But when they do need support, they really lean on each other as sisters to get that. And I really wanted to keep that intact. And also with Flossie, you know, she's one of those characters who brings those lighter moments to the story. You know, she has those moments with the hairbrush, and she's reenacting the Romeo and Juliet scene. And so she's also a way for me to capture how funny my aunt was, and kind of all the laughs she brought us, while also just using her to show that, you know, these sisters loved each other a great deal. And it was through each other that they sort of persevered and survived. And that was definitely a bond that I wanted to keep intact. And Flossie, she'll always be a character who is so dear to my heart. I just love her.
Yeah, I like the interplay between her and Betty a lot. I thought they were like interesting foils for each other. And do you like, maybe that's a good way to segue into talking about the stage that Landon builds for him?
Yeah, so he builds the Three Sisters stage. And, you know, Papa Landon, he loved the environment and nature. And I really look at him as, you know, a conservationist and environmentalist, and someone who really practiced living in harmony. And, you know, I'm one of three sisters, and Mom raised us in the garden, and she always made sure to raise us with knowledge of Landon's techniques and his love of plants. And she also raised us with the Three Sisters gardening technique, which is many different Native tribes adopted it, but the Cherokee also did. And it was something that Landon, because he had grown up in a household with his several generations in a household, and the elders only spoke Cherokee, and he was of a generation where he had to speak both Cherokee and English. And so they spoke to him through story, and they spoke to him through the garden. And something that his mother and his grandmother passed down to him was that matrilineal society of the Cherokee, which really leaned on women as leaders and thinkers. And so Landon, when he built this stage for his three daughters in the garden, he told the eldest, you know, your corn, and he told the middle, your beans, and he told Betty, your squash, and you all grow together because you complement each other and you add benefits to one another. And so he built this stage as a way for them to stand up on it and sort of embrace their power. And it's either Freya or Flossie who asked him, you know, can the boys come up on the stage? And he tells them, no, the stage is just for you. They're not as powerful. And so he's really their ally and their support system at a time when women and girls were really especially facing stereotypes. I mean, we still face them today, but especially then. And he's really telling them that, you know, your gender is what makes you powerful. And that was such strong words, especially coming from a man at the time. And the stage that they would go there to read, and Flossie would go there to act out her plays, and Freya would go there to sing. And so it really became a place that was their own world, and a place where they could really feel as if they were free from any of the weights that was sort of weighing down on them in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, like, very beautiful. I do want to talk a little bit about how tragic all these characters end up being. I mean, I feel like ultimately this is a story that I think has like a hopeful bent to it, but a lot of the characters in it, you know, come to a bad end. You know, I'm thinking of like. I want to say it's Trustin who does the drawings. Yeah. You know, and there's a scene with the water tower, and you already described what happened to Flossie, and obviously what happens to Freya is closer to the central narrative. So again, without giving too much away, you know, Betty's siblings don't fare very well, and I wanted to ask you about that choice. Did you feel like that was, you made those decisions in order to like just add realism or darkness, or like what, or is it just truth? I mean, is it just based on, you know, your actual family history? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think about Freya, and So in the book, I don't want to give too much away, but she has a very particular end. And I chose that for her for the book because in reality, she had become an addict as well. And so her and Flossie actually died the same year, just months apart from overdoses in real life. And so I really wanted to show that in the book, that the things that had been done to her as a child, they pretty much killed her anyways. And especially when she started her addiction, that's really no life to live. And so in some ways, life imitates the art. And when I look at Lint, in real life, he dealt with mental illness. I have fond memories of that uncle, but I know that he was really struggling. And in real life, he had passed of an overdose as well. And so in the book, I was able to actually give him a much happier ending than in real life. And so in some cases, we have the characters sort of mirroring a little of what they experienced in reality. But in the case of Lint, I wanted to see him succeeding. I wanted to see him sort of being able to deal with his mental illness and having a life that I think he would have really wanted. When I had those sessions with Lint and he talked about Landon's impact on his life, he said Dad would sit up all night with me, and because his nights would be especially terrible. He'd get really nervous and antsy, and that's when the thoughts would really start to wall in on him. And Landon would deprive himself of sleep, and he would go in there and he would sit up with Lint all night, and he found that drinking coffee really helped soothe Lint. And so Lint said it was just me and my dad sitting up at night, and it was really this sort of anchor to him that would keep him steady and keep him still in those raging waters. And so when I looked at their real lives compared to kind of their ends in the book, some ways I wanted to mirror that, but in other ways I sort of wanted to lift them up out of that. And so I look at someone like Lint, and I look at especially Betty, who is someone who ultimately is the survivor all of this, and she's sort of walking out of this. I really wanted to concentrate everything good about surviving into her, and then show the kind of wreckage that is left behind by these family secrets or by these family tragedies, and show that this is the cause and effect. And Betty says at the end of the novel, the ripples are still there, and the ripples are eternal. And we get that sense that even though these deaths and even though these tragedies have impacted them, there's still this ripple course going through, and that's the love of Landon, the love of the father, and really that bond of sisterhood. And so I really wanted to sort of represent that in each of the characters when I thought about how I wanted their path to end and where I wanted it to end.
Wow. Yeah, and I mean, you also you focus on storytelling as well, and Betty is like someone who's carrying the story forward, which I also feel like gives her like a greater sense of importance, if that makes sense. Like as basically not only like someone who's preserving these traditions, but someone who just survives to pass them on. And I thought that was like maybe my favorite thing about Betty. I mean, just beside maybe her general toughness, I mean, because you have like the nose cutting in the book, and like you have Landon on one hand, and then Betty on the other, and I think it really kind of solidified that almost like a passing of the torch in a very strange way. And that's one of the things I also wanted to talk to you, maybe like on a little bit of a lighter note, with the Summer That Melted Everything. I felt like it was kind of like one big scene that maybe, sorry, I don't mean to ramble, but the scene where Betty meets the woman who wears the mask.
Oh, Miss Pleasant.
Yeah, Miss Pleasant. And, that was one of those scenes where I felt like that was kind of like a classic, like American Gothic sort of, like this woman just living her life wearing a mask all the time whenever she's outside. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because that was just one of my favorite, like small scenes in the book, but I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. So yeah, so even though some of the family members are based on, like mom and her siblings, so the townspeople are kind of what I just made up from my imagination, and Miss Pleasant is one of those. And so, like in The Summer That Melted Everything, it takes place in Breathitt, and Betty takes place in Breathitt, and I found that it's a town that I use in the majorities of the novels I have written, and so sometimes you'll see these townspeople make an appearance, like we did with Betty. We saw some of the characters from The Summer That Melted Everything. But Miss Pleasant, yeah, I love the idea of this woman who was living in this town, and she was wearing this mask, and there was all these rumors about what does she look like under the mask. It's kind of like, is she deformed? Does she have scars? Was she in a fire? And we eventually learned that secret. But I think especially to Betty, and we're looking at her as a child, and she's holding all these secrets in, and then she comes and she encounters this woman who says, my face is behind this mask because God deformed it because I knew something and I didn't say anything about it. And so I won't say anything too much about that because I don't want to give Betty's storyline away with that, but Betty is holding on to something that she is asking herself, do I talk about this? Do I not talk about this? And seeing Miss Pleasant and sort of having that interaction with her, Betty is seeing the effects of what holding on to secrets can do. And at the end of the novel, we really see her having the freedom from those secrets. But at that point in her life where she's still very much bottled up with things, and she has that encounter with Miss Pleasant, who is someone in the town that is a woman, and she's sort of representing all these sort of bad things that have happened in her life. And so Betty is really sort of saying, I don't want to end up like that. I don't want to be the woman in the mask. And so we have a moment where Betty rushes in and she takes that mask off the woman, and we see what's behind the mask. And I won't tell what's behind the mask, but it's a moment for Betty that sort of speaks to her internal dialogue and says, if do I want to end up like Miss Pleasant? Do I want to be the new woman in the mask in the town? And so I really liked Miss Pleasant. I liked writing her character. I thought that she sort of even with the things that she was saying, she brought a bit of humor to the book. So
yeah, I really like it. It's one of those moments I always appreciate in literature when something's very believable, but it's also very, very bizarre. And like I believe like Betty, I think it's the sheriff's reaction where like Betty kind of says like what Miss Pleasant looks like under the mask, and he just kind of accepts it. And I love that moment. I hope people enjoy that when they read it. Speaking of Breathitt, Ohio, do you think you're going to come back or?
Yeah, yeah, I think I'll be back in Breathitt. And I know some people are, well, you don't really necessarily have the accent of your characters. That I grew up in both Southern Ohio and South Central, and I did my schooling in South Central. And anytime I started to pick up on the same accent that the Breathanians have in the book, Mom would sort of teach it out of us, because she didn't want us to have an accent. Everyone always seemed to comment on her accent. But yeah, Breathitt, it was inspired by the county Papa was born in, and I changed the spelling. It was a county in Kentucky, and then the place itself was inspired by the town I grew up in, and the town that Mom had grown up in. And when I wrote The Summer That Melted Everything, I found myself using Breathitt again. And by that time, I was about 5 or 6 novels in. I had used it as a setting for all of those novels. So I think that it will be a setting that I will revisit and continue to use. And I have over 12 books written now, and for the majority of them, it is Breathitt. I have probably 3 or 4 that's not taken place in Breathitt, but for so far, it's like a character for me.
Yeah, I think it has a personality all its own, and I appreciated going back to, and yeah, I hope there are many more novels in your future. And I just want to thank you for doing this. I think we're about at the time we have. But yeah, again, like there have been 2 like really great conversations that I've had. Being a bookseller has its frustrations, but I feel like getting to do this kind of pays for all. And like this is one of them. The other one I got to talk to Donald Ray Pollock about the Heavenly Table, and we kind of talked about William Gay, and that was a great pleasure too. But Yeah, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. Do you want to like plug anything, or like obviously the book is Betty. I highly recommend it. But yeah, do you have any last words or?
Um, Well, I will. Oh, I will say, I don't have social media, but they can see. Readers can actually see photos of my mother, so they'll get to see
Oh
Betty on
yeah, yeah.
the side, and they'll see Papa Landon's photo and Alka and Lint, and so it's kind of a scrapbook in progress as I upload the photos. But it gives readers a chance to sort of see who they're reading about. So, and they can always, reach out to me through my website. I know I don't have social media, but I do personally answer every email I get. So readers should always feel like my door is open, and the
Yeah, I did
website.
that personally. I actually looked at that after I read the book, and it really did add something. Like those photographs were really kind of striking to see. I just real quick, I wanted to mention like the actual newspaper article where they find Landon still. I like was really kind of blown away by that. So yeah, I would also recommend that. As somebody who read the book, I thought that really added something to it. But yeah, thank you again, Tiffany. The book is Betty. You can buy it at bookloft.com and wherever books are sold. This interview will also be available at bookloft.com. It's going to be uploaded to our YouTube page. And again, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. I had a blast.